The spring sun beat down on Piedmont Park in Atlanta, creating a typical Sunday afternoon scene. Children darted between playground equipment while parents watched from nearby benches. Couples spread checkered blankets on the grass, unpacking sandwiches and fruit. The scene appeared perfectly ordinary, except for the tall figure standing beneath a maple tree. General Elijah Carter, dressed in pressed khakis and a blue polo shirt, maintained his military bearing even in retirement. At 65, his posture remained ramrod straight, his shoes polished to a shine, habits ingrained from 30 years of service. He watched a young boy attempt the monkey bars, remembering similar equipment from basic training. His mind drifted to memories of leading troops through desert heat and mountain terrain, of medals ceremonies and fallen comrades. Officer Brad Stevens cruised past in his patrol car for the third time in 15 minutes. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he observed Carter through narrowed eyes. Stevens had been with the Atlanta Police Department for 12 years, and he prided himself on what he called instinct, the ability to spot trouble before it happened. To Stevens, Carter's presence near the playground set off immediate red flags. "Another one of them hanging around where they don't belong," Stevens muttered to himself, adjusting his body camera. He'd already switched it off, a habit he'd developed when he wanted to handle situations his way. The weight of his badge felt heavy against his chest as he pulled the patrol car to a stop. The confrontation began with Stevens approaching Carter, hand resting casually on his holster. "Sir, we've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Stevens lied, his voice carrying the false politeness he reserved for these encounters. Carter turned, his military training evident in his measured response. "Officer, I'm simply enjoying the park, like everyone else here," Carter replied, maintaining eye contact but keeping his hands visible, another habit from decades of understanding how to handle confrontations. Stevens stepped closer, invading Carter's personal space. "I'll need to see some ID." His tone had shifted, dropping the pretense of courtesy. Families nearby began to notice the interaction, some parents quietly gathering their children and moving away. The situation escalated when Carter reached for his wallet. Stevens, claiming he saw a threatening movement, shoved Carter against the tree. The impact knocked the wind from the older man's lungs. Before Carter could recover his balance, Stevens had him in a chokehold, ignoring the general's attempts to identify himself. "Stop resisting," Stevens shouted, though Carter hadn't moved except to raise his hands in surrender. The officer's knee pressed into Carter's back as he forced him to the ground. The sound of Carter's head hitting the pavement drew gasps from onlookers, who stood frozen, phones in hand but uncertain whether to intervene. Blood trickled from a cut above Carter's eye as Stevens roughly cuffed him, all while spewing racial slurs under his breath. The peaceful park scene had transformed into a tableau of violence, with the decorated general face down on the concrete while children watched in horror and parents hurried them away. Jake Martinez hadn't planned on documenting a civil rights violation that afternoon. The 19-year-old college student had been recording his little sister's birthday party when movement at the edge of his frame caught his attention. His phone captured every second of Stevens' assault on Carter in crisp 4K resolution. Unlike the other bystanders who watched in paralyzed shock, Jake kept his hands steady and his camera focused. He caught Stevens' face contorted with rage, the flash of handcuffs in the sunlight, and most crucially, the clear audio of Stevens' muttered slurs. Years of running his own YouTube channel had taught Jake the importance of stable footage and good sound quality. Now those skills served a darker purpose. "Oh my God, are you getting this?" Jake's mother whispered beside him, her birthday party organizing forgotten. Jake nodded, already pulling up Twitter on his second phone. His hands shook as he typed, "Atlanta PD officer assaulting elderly black man in Piedmont Park, happening now. Please share. #police brutality #Atlanta." He attached the first 30 seconds of footage and hit send. The video spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Within an hour, it had been shared 50,000 times. Local news stations began calling Jake's phone before Carter even reached the hospital. By evening, national networks picked up the story, running the footage on repeat during prime-time broadcasts. The clip's power lay in its clarity. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The camera caught Stephen's unprovoked aggression from multiple angles as Jake had circled the scene. The footage showed Carter's military bearing, his calm demeanor, and the brutal response it received. Every time Stephen slammed Carter against the pavement, social media counters ticked higher. In the emergency room, doctors treated Carter for a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and facial lacerations. News vans gathered outside Grady Memorial Hospital, their satellite dishes stretching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside, Carter lay in a hospital bed, his military discipline evident even in his injured state. He declined pain medication, insisting on remaining clear-headed. The video continued its viral spread. Celebrities shared it with outraged comments. Civil rights organizations issued statements. Local activists organized impromptu protests outside Atlanta Police Department headquarters. Jake's original post had grown to over 1 million shares, with commenters identifying both Carter as a decorated general and Stevens as a police officer with prior complaints. Carter watched the footage for the first time on the small TV in his hospital room. His face remained stoic, but his hands gripped the bedsheets tightly as he witnessed his own humiliation played out for the world to see. The nurses noticed how his heart rate increased, but Carter waved away their concerns. He'd faced enemy fire in combat, yet somehow this violation on American soil cut deeper. Meanwhile, Stevens sat in his supervisor's office, watching his career implode in real time. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow officers, some offering support, others distancing themselves. He'd switched off the TV at home when his children asked why Daddy was on the news. His wife hadn't spoken to him since the footage aired. Maya Richardson drummed her fingers on her notepad, watching Carter through the hospital room's glass door. At 32, she had spent the last decade building a reputation as a journalist who dug deeper than viral headlines. The Atlanta Tribune had sent 3 other reporters before her, but Carter had declined to speak with any of them. General Carter. Maya kept her voice soft as she entered, noting how he straightened despite his injuries. I'm not here for a soundbite or to make you today's trending topic. You've had enough of that already. She placed her press badge on the bedside table, face down. I'm here because what happened to you is part of a pattern, and I think you know that. Carter studied her for a long moment. The bruises on his face had darkened to deep purple, making his military bearing seem even more pronounced. You're the first person to address me by my rank, he observed. Did you serve? No, but my father did. Marine Corps, Vietnam. Maya sat in the visitor's chair, maintaining eye contact. He faced similar situations when he came home. Different decade, same problems. Across town, Officer Stevens paced his kitchen, ignoring his wife's pleas to eat something. His phone displayed another email from Internal Affairs, scheduling yet another interview. The department had placed him on administrative leave, standard procedure they said, but Stevens knew better. The viral video had forced their hand. I was doing my job, he muttered, more to himself than to his wife. If people could see what we deal with every day. He trailed off as another news alert popped up on his phone. His lawyer had advised him to stay off social media, but Stevens couldn't help himself. Each notification felt like another nail in his career's coffin. In Carter's hospital room, Maya listened as the general slowly began to share his story. He spoke of his 30 years of military service, of commanding integrated units in combat zones, of earning respect through leadership rather than force. I learned early that authority doesn't come from fear, he explained, wincing as he shifted position. It comes from respect. And Officer Stevens showed none, Maya noted, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. He showed what he was taught to show, Carter replied, surprising Maya with his insight. Someone trained that young men to see threats where none exist. That's the real story here. Maya's article began taking shape as they talked. Not just about the incident, but about Carter's life, his rise through the military ranks, his combat decorations, his work with veteran organizations after retirement. She captured his dignity, his restraint, and most importantly, his determination to turn this incident into something meaningful. This isn't just about me, Carter insisted as their interview wound down. Every time something like this happens, people get angry, they protest, they demand change. But then the news cycle moves on, and nothing really changes. I won't let that happen this time. As Maya packed up her notebook, Stevens was receiving another kind of visitor. Internal affairs investigators sat in his living room, their questions becoming increasingly pointed. They had accessed his body camera footage, or rather, the suspicious gap in footage during the incident. His explanation about equipment malfunction felt weak even to his own ears. "Your record shows 3 other complaints of excessive force," one investigator noted, flipping through a thick file. "All involving minority civilians. Would you care to explain that pattern, Officer Stevens?" Angela Roberts had known Elijah Carter for 20 years, since they'd both served on the local Veterans Affairs Committee. Now, standing on the steps of Atlanta Police Department headquarters, she gripped a megaphone and faced a crowd that stretched for 3 city blocks. "We are not here for violence," her voice carried across the assembly. "We are here because violence was done to one of our most respected citizens. A man who served this country for 30 years can't walk in a public park without being assaulted by those sworn to protect and serve." The protest had grown beyond anything Angela originally planned. What started as a Facebook event shared among local veterans groups had exploded into a national movement. People held signs displaying Carter's military photo alongside images from the viral video. The contrast was stark, a decorated general in full dress uniform versus the same man face down on concrete under Stevens' knee. Social media amplified every moment of the protest. Live streams captured the diverse crowd, veterans in military caps standing alongside college students, families with children hoisting handmade signs, clergy members leading prayers for peace and justice. Local news helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting aerial shots that showed the true scale of the gathering. Inside police headquarters, Chief Williams watched the growing crowd with mounting concern. He'd hoped placing Stevens on administrative leave would calm the situation, but the public demanded more. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from the mayor's office, each conversation more urgent than the last. "The general's video has hit 50 million views," his media relations officer reported. "It's being shared by celebrities, politicians, even other police departments condemning the behavior. Sir, we need to make a stronger statement." The protest's momentum built throughout the day. Angela organized speakers, each sharing stories of similar encounters with law enforcement. But it was the arrival of Carter himself, still showing signs of his injuries but walking tall, that electrified the crowd. "I stand before you not as a victim," Carter's voice was firm despite his physical pain, "but as a witness. What happened to me happens every day to those without medals, without cameras recording, without viral videos to prove their truth." The crowd fell silent as Carter described his military career, his years of service, and the irony of facing greatest danger not in combat, but in an Atlanta park. He spoke without anger, which somehow made his words more powerful. When he described how Stevens had ignored his attempts to identify himself, many in the crowd wiped away tears. Meanwhile, Stevens watched the coverage from his home, his children kept away from school due to threats. His wife had taken them to her sister's house, leaving him alone with news reports and social media notifications. Each new protest sign he saw felt like a personal accusation. The day culminated in an unexpected moment when a group of police officers, led by a veteran sergeant, removed their badges and joined the protesters. The images went viral immediately, law enforcement standing in solidarity with Carter's supporters, demanding accountability from within their own ranks. "This is how change begins," Angela told reporters as the protest peacefully dispersed at sunset. "Not with violence, but with unity. Not with hatred, but with determination. General Carter's dignity in the face of brutality has shown us the way forward." Officer Brad Stevens jolted awake at 3 a.m., his shirt soaked with sweat. In his dream, he was back in the park, but this time he was the one pinned to the ground, unable to breathe, while faces in the crowd recorded his humiliation. His hand instinctively reached for his service weapon, now locked away per department orders. The nightmares had become routine since the incident. Each night, his subconscious forced him to relive the moment from different angles. Sometimes he saw himself through the lens of Jake's viral video, watching his own face contort with rage. Other times, he was a child again, watching his father, also a police officer, using similar tactics during traffic stops in the 1990s. Downstairs, his wife Lisa sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through hundreds of social media messages. Many called her husband a monster. Others threatened their family. She deleted her Facebook account, changed her phone number, but the messages kept coming. Their children's school had suggested remote learning for their safety. "I don't know who you are anymore," Lisa had told him yesterday, after finding his collection of racist memes saved on his phone. "Or maybe I never knew." She'd packed a bag this morning, saying she needed time to think. Stevens knew she was really saying she needed time to decide if their marriage could survive this. The department-mandated psychiatrist had asked Stevens about his childhood, about watching his father patrol the same streets he now worked. "Did you ever question his methods?" the psychiatrist probed. Stevens had deflected, but the question haunted him. He remembered riding along in his father's patrol car, listening to conversations filled with racial slurs and jokes about maintaining order. Lisa visited her parents, seeking guidance. Her father, a retired judge, watched the viral video in silence. "Brad's not just going to lose his job," he finally said. "He's going to face criminal charges. You need to think about the children's future." The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on Stevens like a physical force. His fellow officers avoided eye contact in the hallways. His partner requested a transfer. The union representative spoke about protocol and procedure instead of offering unconditional support. Even his father, now retired in Florida, sent a terse text, "You should have turned off the cameras completely." At night, Stevens found himself parked outside his childhood home, now occupied by strangers. He remembered his father's lessons about policing, who to stop, who to search, who to suspect. He'd absorbed those lessons without question, carried them into his own career like an inheritance. Now, watching protesters march with Carter's photo, he felt the foundation of his beliefs cracking. Lisa attended church alone for the first time in their marriage. The pastor's sermon about redemption and accountability felt pointed. After the service, she avoided the whispers and stares of congregation members who'd known her family for years. In the car, she finally read Carter's military biography, learning about his combat decorations and community service. The men her husband had assaulted had helped establish a veterans' mental health clinic just blocks from their home. "Daddy hurt someone bad," their 6-year-old daughter had said, overhearing news reports. "Like the bad guys in my books." The innocence of the question broke something in Lisa. That night, she started researching divorce lawyers, keeping the browser in incognito mode. The Internal Affairs conference room felt smaller than Stevens remembered. 5 senior officers sat across the table, their faces impassive as they reviewed his service record. Video screens on the wall displayed freeze frames from the park incident, each image more damaging than the last. "Officer Stevens," Captain Rodriguez began, sliding a thick folder across the table. "We've completed our preliminary investigation. Would you like to explain why your body camera was deactivated exactly 2 minutes before your interaction with General Carter?" Stevens' rehearsed explanation about equipment malfunction withered under their scrutiny. The technical department had already confirmed no mechanical issues. Worse, they'd discovered a pattern of suspicious gaps in his footage over the past year, all during civilian interactions that resulted in complaints. Across town, Carter received the Civil Rights Leadership Award at a ceremony attended by state officials and national media. His acceptance speech was brief but powerful, delivered with military precision despite his still healing injuries. "This award belongs to every person who has faced injustice in silence," Carter stated, gripping the podium. "To every parent who has had to teach their children how to survive a police encounter. To every veteran who, like me, returned home to find that the rights we fought to protect aren't equally distributed." The city had become a powder keg. Pro-police rallies clashed with civil rights protesters downtown. Local businesses boarded up windows, fearing escalation. The mayor's office received thousands of calls demanding Stevens' termination, while police union supporters organized counter-protests defending law enforcement rights. Inside the conference room, the investigation continued. "We've uncovered 17 incidents in your career involving excessive force complaints," Captain Rodriguez continued. 15 involved minority civilians. None resulted in disciplinary action. "Can you explain this pattern?" Stevens shifted in his chair, his lawyer whispering cautionary advice. The union representative beside him stayed silent, his notepad conspicuously empty. The old defenses about split-second decisions and officer safety felt hollow under the weight of Carter's viral video. The city council called an emergency session to address police reform. Carter's case had exposed systemic issues beyond one officer's actions. Body camera policies, use of force guidelines, and oversight procedures all faced scrutiny. Local activists filled the chamber, demanding concrete changes rather than symbolic gestures. Your father, Officer James Stevens, had similar complaints during his career, Rodriguez noted, producing another file. You worked several shifts with him before his retirement. Did his methods influence your approach to policing? Stevens felt sweat trickle down his back. The question probed too close to late-night conversations in patrol cars, to lessons learned watching his father maintain order in minority neighborhoods. His lawyer intervened before he could respond, but the damage was done. Outside, the division in the community deepened. Police supporters claimed Stevens was being sacrificed to political correctness. Civil rights advocates argued the case represented just the tip of the iceberg. Local businesses reported losing customers as people avoided downtown areas where protesters gathered. Given the evidence, Rodriguez concluded, we're recommending termination. The department will also cooperate fully with the district attorney's criminal investigation. The television studio lights felt hot as Carter adjusted his tie. CNN had scheduled a primetime special, Policing in America, A Veteran's Perspective. The makeup artist carefully powdered his face, trying to minimize the still visible bruises from Stevens' attack. We're live in 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on, and Anderson Cooper began. General Elijah Carter, a decorated military veteran with 30 years of service, was assaulted by police in an Atlanta park. Tonight, he joins us to discuss police reform, racial profiling, and the path forward. Simultaneously, across town, Stevens sat in his first media interview, a local conservative network that promised a fair hearing. His department-appointed PR advisor had warned against it, but Stevens insisted. He needed to tell his side. I followed protocol, Stevens repeated, his rehearsed defense sounding mechanical. In today's climate, officers have to make split-second decisions. The interviewer, hoping for viral soundbites, pressed harder. But was protocol designed to put decorated veterans in the hospital? Carter's interview took a different approach. He spoke methodically about police training, comparing it to military protocols. In combat zones, we had stricter rules of engagement than what I witnessed in that park, he explained. We trained soldiers to de-escalate, to use force as an absolute last resort. Why aren't we demanding the same from our police? The contrast between the two interviews couldn't have been starker. Carter appeared statesmanlike, discussing systemic solutions rather than personal grievances. Stevens seemed defensive, each answer digging him deeper into a hole of contradictions and excuses. National media descended on Atlanta. Every major network ran special reports. Cable news channels featured panels of experts analyzing police training, racial bias, and the intersection of military service and civil rights. Carter's military record became a focal point. His combat decorations, leadership awards, and post-service community work made Stevens' actions seem even more egregious. What message does it send, one commentator asked, when a black veteran faces more danger in an American park than he did in combat zones? The formal investigation into Stevens' conduct expanded. Internal Affairs discovered a pattern of similar incidents, carefully hidden by deactivated body cameras and vague report writing. Each revelation sparked new headlines, new protests, new calls for reform. Carter's television appearances continued. He spoke at town halls, participated in panel discussions, gave interviews to print media. His message remained consistent. This wasn't about one officer or one incident, but about systemic failures in police training and accountability. We're not asking for special treatment, Carter explained during a particularly powerful segment. We're asking for equal treatment. When I commanded troops, I never asked about their race, religion, or background. I judged them by their actions, their character. Why isn't that standard universal? Stevens watched his own public image deteriorate with each passing day. His interview had backfired spectacularly, with clips of his most offensive moments going viral. Social media users dissected his body language, his choice of words, his attempts to justify the unjustifiable. The investigation's preliminary findings leaked to the press. Stevens had a history of targeting minority civilians, a pattern of disabled body cameras, and a trail of suspicious incident reports. Each new revelation strengthened Carter's call for systemic reform while destroying Stevens' remaining credibility. Maya Richardson stared at the stack of personnel files on her desk, obtained through carefully cultivated sources within the department. The pattern was undeniable once you saw it. Like father, like son, a generational legacy of abuse hidden behind badges. Officer James Stevens Sr., Brad's father, had worked at Atlanta PD from 1985 to 2010. His file contained 23 excessive force complaints, all involving minority civilians, all mysteriously cleared or buried in administrative red tape. Maya traced a clear timeline. Brad Stevens had started riding along in his father's patrol car at age 12, absorbing those lessons, watching that behavior become normalized. "I need to interview you again," Maya told Stevens over the phone. "This time about your father." The silence on the line lasted so long she thought he'd hung up. "Leave my family out of this," Stevens finally responded, his voice tense. But Maya pressed on. 1997 Vine Street incident. "You were 14, riding along with your father. He assaulted a black veteran during a traffic stop. Sound familiar?" Maya knew she'd struck a nerve when Stevens' breathing changed. "That veteran filed a complaint. Nothing happened. Now here we are, 25 years later, and you're following the same playbook." The interview took place in Stevens' lawyer's office. Maya noticed how Stevens sat ramrod straight, defensive, his father's police academy graduation photo visible in his phone's wallpaper. She recorded everything as Stevens gradually unraveled under her questioning. "Dad taught me how to be a real cop," Stevens finally admitted, ignoring his lawyer's attempts to silence him. "He said you couldn't trust them. That they were always hiding something. That's what I learned riding in his car. That's what every senior officer reinforced during my training." Maya's investigation expanded. She uncovered a network of older officers, trained by Stevens Sr., who had passed down the same prejudices, the same tactics, the same methods of covering up misconduct. It wasn't just one bad apple, it was an orchard cultivated through generations of institutional racism. The story broke on a Sunday. Legacy of Violence: How Police Prejudice Passes from Father to Son. Maya's article included testimony from former officers, internal documents, and a devastating timeline connecting Stevens Sr.'s misconduct to his son's current case. Stevens Jr. watched his entire worldview crumble as the article went viral. His father called from Florida, raging about loyalty and betrayal. But for the first time, Stevens heard something else in his father's voice: fear. Fear that his own misdeeds would be exposed. Fear that his legacy would be revealed for what it truly was. Carter read the article in his study, highlighting key passages. "This is bigger than we thought," he told Maya during their follow-up interview. "It's not just about training or policy. It's about generational trauma being inflicted by those sworn to protect and serve." Atlanta transformed into ground zero for a national conversation about policing. Carter's case, combined with Maya's exposé on the Stevens family, created a perfect storm that demanded more than just superficial reform. The city found itself under a microscope, with every police interaction scrutinized and documented. Carter's speaking engagements evolved from simple testimonials to masterclasses in systemic change. Universities invited him to lecture on criminal justice reform. Police academies across the country requested his input on training protocols. His military background lent crucial credibility. When he spoke about proper use of force and chain of command, both conservatives and liberals listened. "The military taught me that leadership flows both ways," Carter explained to a packed auditorium at Emory University. "We're accountable to those we command, just as they're accountable to us. Why isn't police leadership held to the same standard?" Meanwhile, Stevens' personal life imploded. His wife Lisa filed for divorce, citing the psychological impact on their children. His father, further implicated by Maya's continuing investigation, cut off contact and fled to Costa Rica, leaving Stevens to face the mounting accusations alone. The ripple effects spread through the department. Veteran officers who had trained under Stevens Sr. suddenly requested early retirement. Younger officers came forward with stories of being pressured to adopt old-school tactics. The thin blue line began to crack under the weight of long-buried truths. Community meetings became forums for change. Carter worked with local activists to develop concrete proposals, civilian oversight boards with real power, mandatory body camera protocols with severe penalties for violations, psychological screening for generational bias in police families. "We're not just fighting individual prejudice," Carter testified before the city council. "We're fighting inherited bias, passed down through generations of police families like toxic heirlooms." Breaking that cycle requires more than just new policies, it requires a complete cultural reset. The city's response gained national attention. Other municipalities sent observers to study Atlanta's emerging reforms. Carter's model of combining military discipline with community policing attracted interest from police departments nationwide. Stevens, watching his former colleagues embrace change, retreated further into isolation. His lawyer advised him to maintain public silence, but private recordings leaked of him ranting about tradition and betrayal. Each new outburst only reinforced the arguments for systemic change. Local businesses and community organizations rallied around Carter's initiatives. A coalition of military veterans launched a program to recruit former service members into police roles, emphasizing de-escalation techniques and community engagement. "What happened in that park was a symptom," Carter told Maya in a follow-up interview. "The real disease is the culture that taught Officer Stevens that his actions were acceptable. That's what we're fighting now." The public hearing room fell silent as the video began playing on multiple screens. This wasn't the familiar park footage, this was something older, grainier. Date stamp, 2019. Location, a dark street in southwest Atlanta. The body camera footage, supposedly lost in a system upgrade, showed Stevens using identical tactics on another veteran, Thomas Green. Maya had discovered the footage buried in a cloud backup, missed during Stevens' routine evidence purges. Green had filed a complaint that vanished into administrative limbo. Now, sitting in the hearing room next to Carter, Green watched himself being assaulted all over again. Officer Stevens demonstrated a clear pattern of targeting military veterans of color, the Internal Affairs investigator announced. "We've uncovered 5 similar incidents over the past 3 years, all deliberately hidden through disabled body cameras and falsified reports." Stevens sat rigid in his chair as more evidence mounted. Former partners testified about his methods for avoiding oversight. Rookie officers described his training sessions, where he taught them to target specific demographics. Each revelation stripped away another layer of his carefully constructed defense. The climactic moment came when Maya presented her final piece of evidence, a series of text messages between Stevens and his father, discussing techniques for handling minority suspects and concealing misconduct. The messages spanned years, revealing a deliberate strategy of discrimination passed from father to son. "This isn't just about one officer," Carter addressed the hearing. "This is about a system that allowed this behavior to become hereditary." Officer Stevens learned these tactics from his father, who learned them from his supervisors, creating a cycle of abuse that spans generations. Stevens finally broke. Standing up against his lawyer's restraining hand, he launched into a rage-filled tirade that confirmed every accusation. "My father taught me how to be a real cop," he shouted. "You're all trying to destroy everything we built, everything we protected." The hearing ended with unanimous recommendations, immediate termination, criminal charges, and a complete review of every case Stevens had ever handled. But the implications reached far beyond one officer's career. Carter's advocacy led to the creation of the Veterans Police Oversight Committee, a pioneering program that utilized military leadership principles to reshape police training. Maya's investigation sparked a national audit of generational police families, examining how bias passed through police dynasties. In the final scene, Stevens watched from his lawyer's office as officers arrived at his home with a warrant. His father, tracked down in Costa Rica, faced extradition for his own recently uncovered crimes. The generational chain of abuse had finally broken. Carter stood outside the hearing room, surrounded by supporters and fellow veterans. "This isn't the end," he told the assembled press. "This is just the beginning of real change. Today we've shown that no one is above accountability, that wearing a badge doesn't mean escaping justice." The story concluded with a powerful image: Carter and Green, both veterans who had survived Stevens' abuse, leading a ceremony to inaugurate a new police training facility. Above the entrance, a plaque read, "To protect and serve all citizens equally." This ending revealed how the personal conflict between Carter and Stevens had uncovered a deeper, systemic problem, leading to meaningful reform and breaking a cycle of inherited prejudice in law enforcement.